Welcome to Inside Policy Talks. This is Dr. Balkan Devlen. I'm the Director of Transatlantic Program here at MLI. And today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Richard Shimooka, who's a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Richard, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Today we will talk about the recent announcement that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Defense Minister Anita Anand made in Riga prior to the Vilnius NATO summit in Vilnius, identifying the roadmap for enhancing the enhanced forward presence mission that Canada is the framework nation in Latvia. They announced a roadmap that lay out how Canada will take its leadership role in the mission further and bring the enhanced forward presence there from a battalion sized group to a brigade sized group. So today I want to talk a little bit on that, on that particular roadmap. What it contains. Is it achievable? What needs to be done to meet the commitments that we made back in Madrid, and that it took a little while for us to specify how are we going to up our strength over there, and why it is important for Canada and Canadians to be able to fulfill the particular promises that we made, both in Madrid as well as in this new roadmap. So maybe we can start with the roadmap, what it contains, what are the sort of the key elements. We don't necessarily need to go one-on-one on everything, and we'll be happy to put the link to the actual agreement on the show notes, and people can go and check it out. But what are the key elements there that Canada promises to our Latvian allies in terms of strengthening the enhanced forward presence in Latvia?
Certainly. So it's basically a plan that sort of lays out a gradual increase of Canada's deployed forces in Latvia, currently at around 800 or so, to around 2,200. And it's going to be a slow go. It's going to take 3 years for Canada to sort of build up the forces, to train and prep the existing forces to be ready to sort of deploy and then be deployed, as well as building up the facilities in Latvia in order to effectively have a permanent presence for the foreseeable time being. And that phase approach sort of has 3 phases. Third phase, obviously, is the steady state, which is the final deployment. But the critical parts is sort of building the Canadian forces to be able to deploy there. And I think that's the part that a lot of people are sort of looking at and are really wondering. Because if we look at the Canadian forces right now, even the 800 troops or so that we've got in theater, which has some sort of advanced capabilities, such as a increase in the tank squadron, this is already having a significant straining effect on the Canadian forces. It's using a lot of its sort of the most advanced equipment that we have, but there's significant areas where the Canadian forces does not have capabilities that it's going to require to be a effective sort of useful actor in the field for our allies and in the defense of Latvia and the Baltics. And the questions surrounding that are the ones that are most interesting, because without any sort of, some that were not addressed, some of them are addressed, but the devil's is obviously in the details, and how Canada is going to sort of put together that force, even in 3 years, which in terms of a military deployment time is actually quite a long time. The ability of Canada to actually meet the requirements or the needs in the field is not exactly clear. And I think a lot of people are wondering about that, who are aware of what Canada can do and what's needed in the field.
I mean, let me just sort of get into details a little bit and to understand in a better way. So, no, this is sort of the culmination of promises that were made in Madrid summit that will bring the enhanced forward presence missions in the Baltics and in Poland to a brigade level, and other allies are making announcements. Germans did it, for example, for Lithuania, that they will be deploying 4,000 troops. we'll see how that will develop and when and how, etc. And of course, the Brits in Estonia will need to bring it up to the brigade level as well. And Americans are already in Poland with substantial numbers, more than that at any rate. So it is important to be able to get to a brigade level. For the audience, could you maybe give a sense of what do we mean by when we talk about a brigade level? How many troops are we talking about? What will be the sort of the shortfall if you included 2,200 Canadian troops? What will be the shortfall, and how are we going to sort of figure it out? And then we can expand a little bit on what are the what is missing from this roadmap. What will be the sort of the necessary capabilities for that the brigade to be an effective fighting force. And ideally less than a 3-year period, which will come in a minute. So first, maybe what do we mean by brigade, and then second, how can we get up to that particular number? Because 2,200 will not be enough.
Certainly. So a brigade is about 5,000 troops, and I mean it usually requires a panoply of sort of capabilities. We're not just talking about infantry that carries the rifles. We're talking about tanks. As we talked about the Canadian sort of deployment of likely around 20 tanks or so. You're talking about artillery systems, air defense systems at all levels. And this is a kind of a critical point that we'll circle back on. You're talking about command and control, intelligence, logistics is a core consideration. So you're looking at a whole wide range of capabilities that will sort of basically make the brigade an effective actor in any sort of conflict. Right now, Canada's kind of struggling with some of those aspects. Now, part of it is that we're not going to, at 2,200, we're not going to provide a full brigade. We're basically providing a half brigade. And we're looking at some of our other allies. I believe the Danes and whatnot are being sort of pulled into this to fill out our sort of capability. Canada's not going to be able to put a full brigade in with its current force structure. Even during our years in Afghanistan, we would have, which was probably the height of the Canadian Army's post-Cold War sort of force structure. They would not be able to sort of do that. We have what's called a managed readiness structure, which basically is designed to allow the deployment around 2,000, 2,500 troops consistently without having to, with being able to sustain that permanently without actually having to turn around and have a shortfall in the future. There's questions where, again, they can do that. We are clearly undermanned 10%, if not more, in some key sort of manning areas. So Canada's sort of contribution is going to be this 2,000 troops. The problem is if we look at how conflict is occurring in Ukraine, we look at the proliferation of unmanned aerial combat vehicles, drones. We look at just how heavy the artillery usage is, where we're seeing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of shells used per month in order to sort of conduct operations. Not just short-range artillery shells, which is the 155 millimeter, but shell or gun, but also a longer range sort of deeper strike weapons like HIMARS, ATACMS, those sort of systems. They're all part of a broader combat capability that a modern brigade needs. And it's areas that Canada's really deficient in. Another area that's even more substantial is our command and control systems, which really need updating. And there's an ongoing program, colloquially known as SSC 42, which is basically it's around, I think, 5 or 6 separate sort of systems that Canadian Armed Forces are looking at to acquiring, and they need to get them now in order to sort of operate effectively in coordination with our allies. And these systems are somewhat, they haven't been acquired. They're still in sort of the acquisition phase. Whether or not they'll get into the field in time is an open question. It's not clear because we are delayed on the acquiring of major capabilities like this. So this is, I've kind of thrown a lot of sort of capabilities on the table here, but in truth, if we're looking at the environment that this force is going to need to operate in, if it ever sort of turn hot or turn violent, the Canadian forces may have the raw numbers of troops to sort of deploy, but some of those key capabilities, many of which our allies are buying or have sort of been ramping up to buy, we just don't have them, or we're delayed on the acquisition for them. So that's kind of the the spiel on where, what's needed, what's the size of this force, what are sort of capabilities that you'd be looking at?
Would that create a vulnerability in the eastern flank, in the sense that if you think about those 4 EFP missions and then the 4 new ones, of course, and especially if they are each getting into brigade level, and if they're properly equipped in other parts of that, given the fact that we may not be able to sort of field those capabilities, even if we want to buy them, you can't order them through Amazon. It's not so. What would be the sort of vulnerability that would create, and how that actually meets with the needs to fulfill our commitments to our NATO allies, and of course, I'll be happy to talk more and get into details what you think might be a realistic way to ensure that the Canada-led EFP mission is not the one ends up being a weak link in that chain.
Certainly, it is vulnerability. I mean, if we aren't sort of seamlessly interoperable, is sort of the term is used, it makes our unit less able to sort of operate effectively in the battlefield. I mean, clearly the Russian Federation is weaker than they were about 3 years ago, right? Because of the war in Ukraine. But if we look at some of the capabilities that they are deploying en masse, even in their weakened state in Ukraine, we don't even have challenges towards them. We have a counter for them or ability to sort of degrade them. If you look at how modern sort of warfare is being prosecuted and fought, the command and control side is absolutely critical. You see the United States Army investing billions in programs that they're designed to sort of integrate dispersed amounts of information from sources, whether it be aerial or space-based sources, whatnot, and bring them into a sort of seamless picture of the battlefield. We're just not there yet. We're not even close to being there. And our contribution in a place where clearly we are the enhanced forces of presence, we are right at the border with Russia, would require us to be able to operate in sort of as good level as the United States in anticipation for war. There's no point to actually deploy something if we're just unable to actually operate effectively. It's a disservice to our allies. It's disservice to the servicemen and women that we put in harm's way. So in this case, we are potentially a weak link in that sense. I mean, there's so many other areas. We have 3 current urgent operational requests that are ongoing on anti-tank systems, counter UAV and short-range air defense systems. That they were supposed to be done within a year. This was highlighted a year ago as the war sort of unfolded, and instead of actually filling them, they've now decided, well, we're going to have to run a competition for these, which was going to add another year, if not more, to sort of acquiring systems, which means that when we actually do get them and put them into service, it actually puts more pressure on the troops that are potentially going to go in the first sort of waves of this increase in enhanced foreign presence. And it's going to cause them issues with their training. They're sort of, the rush to deployment. They're not going to be as sort of as ready to sort of utilize them. And this is all going to snowball, because if we're just going to rush and sort of deploy stuff or with minimal training or early training, right? It's not as effective. It's kind of a repeat of what we saw during the Afghanistan operations at the very early stages, where we start showing up with green uniforms and Iltis jeeps when we're starting to already see IED, improvised explosive devices, which these vehicles are not effective to be used at, or our camouflage is really not. It makes us stick out in this terrain as a sore thumb. It's the same sort of problem. It's just we're kind of behind the 8 ball. We're rushing to catch up with this when a lot of the stuff was known 8 years ago that we needed a replacement, or we need a replacement for these systems and that. And this has really become a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have been pointing out in your writing and in your commentary that this is much more of a structural issue that we need to be addressing. But I think it's also within the EFB context, it's also quite important to be able to fulfill the commitments to our NATO allies that we made. And even with these sort of limited, commitments that are announced in the roadmap, like you pointed out, maybe half a brigade there, they're not very clear. At least from the text that I can see, very specific, capabilities that are announced. I don't know how it's gonna go there, and a long time frame, 3 years. which very conveniently happened to end in 2026 after the next election. So the government may or may not need to be the one who need to deliver that by the deadline.
I'll be honest with you. I just interject there. I actually don't think that was even consideration, because I think that's how long it's actually going to take.
Wow.
I mean, this is in order to even get them to a level where they are an effective unit that they can actually provide effective sort of, defense capability because we don't have some of these critical capabilities ready to go. I think the 3-year time frame is basically the best we could do. I can go into a couple of the specific systems, but that's just the reality. And it's not unlike what happened with the original deployment for enhanced forward presence, where just getting 700 troops took over a year to deploy into Latvia, because the command and control systems at the time were, again, not up to date. Key capabilities were not there, and it caused the Canadian Armed Forces significant challenges to be basically deployed into the region.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask two questions on this one, actually. One particularly about what's called persistence presence rather than a permanent deployment. Do you think it would make a difference rather than deploy the troops for like 6-month rotations? If we deploy them in a full term, in sort of 3-year deployments, would that make a difference in terms of because they have more in and out? You're talking effectively, or maybe 3.5 months of very but if you do have a permanent deployment there, that might actually enable, because it's also a very large and very diverse EFP, right? We have 10, 11 nations as a part of that, and be able to work with them in the long term. And it may perhaps help if we have permanent deployments, long-term deployments, with the recruitment as well. I don't know. You're the military expert on that, but would that make a difference if our commitments are not just a 6-month deployment, but announcing that we will deploy those troops for, say, a 3-year deployment?
Yeah, so that sort of draws in some much more bigger considerations. One of the biggest ones, because this would basically bring it back to where we had the 4th Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, I'll have the number there, in Germany in the Cold War, and sort of the deployment there. So then you're bringing questions about families. Are we going to be able to bring families and have them live in Latvia or whatever, possibly? But given the position of the enhanced forward presence, a little bit different than in Germany, because you're right on the front. Not that conflict, we would anticipate conflict, but the fact that they were there, do you want to have families in Latvia nearby, right? And how do we sort of build that out? That's going to be a significant larger cost, because then you're looking at not just barracks, but potentially family quarters and whatnot. So that's one area. I believe it requires some significant changes. There's significant changes to how we sort of look at just for pay rates and and other areas. Not as clear into this areas as others would be, but certainly I know that would be an area that would be a consideration. So going beyond the 6-month, cycling and sort of that kind of aspect kind of brings in different challenges, right? And my
anecdotal sort of data on this is when you talk with a few people that were deployed previously or deployed again, because a lot of these troops had multiple deployments to Riga themselves. Seems to be that they're actually, they might be quite interested in that, being able to bring the families. And of course, Riga is a lovely place to live, and very, the relationship is of course excellent. So on the anecdotal level, there seems to be would be happy to see something like that, rather than being deployed the 4th time across 3 years.
Absolutely.
6 months.
No, absolutely. And the sort of the management cycle and sort of undertaking this operations is not harmful, but it certainly is a challenge for the Canadian Forces. I think there's going to be real personnel struggles to sort of keep this within the cycle. Just knowing where the Canadian forces are, I wonder if other missions are going to be reduced even further, just to keep it going, because that's what happened in the years in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
Canadian forces really had one mission and just was doing everything it can, especially in some of the specialist areas, just to continually fill these capability sets that are not very that are sort of in demand. So stuff like, let's say, cyber warfare or intelligence, right? The Canadian Forces is basically now going to just be focused on this mission set. And if we're doing this as a kind of a 6-month rotational cycle, it's going to be a challenge, right? Whereas as you're right, if we have a 3-year sort of term or whatever, right, it does decrease the requirements, or it decreases the sort of pressure on the Canadian Army and the Canadian Forces writ large on sort of sustain this. And absolutely right, I think that a lot of individuals would be interested in sort of a longer deployment if they can have families, if it's not as austere as it currently is. Not saying it's austere badly. This isn't, we're not talking about Afghanistan, but certainly it's we don't have as many permanent structures. These are sort of a base that is sort of was built kind of in parts, right? If we have a more sustained, thought out sort of approach to this and a more permanent presence, yes, that we're foreseeing this for not 2, 3, 4 years, but we say we're going to be here for 10 years clearly. It makes it easier for the force planners to sort of put this together, put together a concept of operations, concept of the sustainment and all that, and sort of make this a more sort of comfortable and effective also capability that we're putting into the field.
I mean, on that, I mean, perhaps sort of a bigger picture is that as each of these missions are going up to brigade level, again, you're the military expert on this, but to me, it feels like, coordinating within a battalion size is already hard with multiple, different groups with different, engagement rules and with different equipment, with different everything else. Scaling up even within the mission themselves to brigade level would require much more time to be able to work together effectively. And especially if we think about across Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, for those groups to work together, the whole idea of working not separately, but also in a continuous together would require perhaps exercising a lot more and so on and so forth. So unless I would say perhaps all those troops are more permanently deployed, it will be very hard to be able to get into that particular habit of working together as in a coherent way. So I think there is a bigger regional sort of defense lens here as well that we need to take. And there's something that I have been making the arguments for in different places, is that we also sort of get rid of the Russia NATO Founding Act of 1997 officially as well, and then start deploying permanently bases in the eastern flank as well. So I think having from a not only sort of individual and henceforward presence missions, but also as a collective, making them as a capable force. Would require them to work together much more and exercise together much more often, and that would probably require longer deployments. And of course, Latvia is in the roadmap. Initially, devoting $38 million for a new base. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that will be the largest the base in the Baltics. The second largest being at Aji. So there's a significant infrastructure investment going there as well. So keeping that in mind as we sort of plan forward, I think might be a good idea.
Certainly, having more troops there for longer on an individual basis increases sort of competency and knowledge base, and it does reduce the pressure on the Canadian forces to sort of scrounge up sort of troops that haven't been deployed and all that. I can recall that during the Afghan sort of period when, again, I was referring to as specialist capabilities. Back then, it was individuals who were involved with the provincial reconstruction teams or the CIMIC or the civil military cooperation groups or the intelligence groups, these individuals were constantly being deployed because there weren't enough of these individuals, right? There just weren't enough. So you had guys and men and women, excuse me, that were being put on rotation, 6 on, 6 off. That's part of one of the issues that we have. We have among our allies one of the shorter sort of rotational cycles at 6 months, whereas the Americans usually are around a year or a little less. And so you have a sort of large amount of disruption. You have people who are sort of coming in training, when they get in the field, getting their sort of wits about them. Then they're in the field for however many months, and then they're pulled back, and the next wave of people come in, right? If we have a year plus kind of deployment cycle for people who are, they live in a barracks that are maybe with their families, they obviously keep that competency. You have a sort of chain of knowledge that gets passed along to individuals, and obviously it's a much more comfortable place. Latvia is the politics are very nice region in the area. It's worth, it makes it a little easier rather than the sort of disruptive 6-month cycle, especially if you have people at home. It's not as enjoyable, let's say, or it's not as comfortable. So I think that would aid several different objectives. I say with interoperability with our allies, we can kind of maximize the systems. If we're buying systems, we can maximize their sort of the knowledge base on them and keep them, ready to go, or keep them, identify the best use of them or potential best use of them. We are allies. Those would all be benefits of a longer deployment cycle if we're doing it. And that would be, obviously, as I was saying before, keeping a more permanent presence that has the forces rather than doing a rotational system.
We're coming slowly to the end, but I want to ask two questions. One, and then of course, sort of last sort of wrap up ideas. The first one is, so when you look at the roadmap, what's the most important thing that seems to be missing from that has been laid out? What if it was you who were drafting it up? What would you include in that roadmap that has been announced? That took a while, but to announce, and as you point out, the detail is the devil is in the details. Let's see how the implementation would go, including the amounts being attached to it, and so on and so forth. But what seems to be the missing element that you think needs to be there? That's number one. Number two is then again, bring it back for the Canadian audience. Why fulfilling this particular set of commitments is important for Canada and Canadians in protecting our security and prosperity?
I'll take the second one first, because I think it's a capstone, right? Yes. I think Canada, and certainly since the Second World War, even before that, has always kind of seen themselves as a good ally, right? Canadians certainly believe that's the case. I think we're a multinational sort of country with different ethnic groups that kind of brought from different places, and many of us see sort of like a child of the international sphere, right? And being part of NATO has helped us sort of maintain our position as a good security partner with our allies within the international sphere, as a source of stability and sort of a source of stability, and also a way to increase our prosperity, right? You have a stable international sphere, you have stable trade, and Canada is basically one of the net beneficiaries of this economic international system that has existed since World War II, if not later. So, with that being the case, I think Canadians want to sort of be a part of that. I think Canadian governments have long communicated that we are a good partner. We are going to be effective, and this is a really, really key area where we can do that if done right. That the Eastern European nations or states that are part of NATO are in dire fear of their own political situation, given that they've just watched what's happening in Ukraine. And they want to feel reassured that Canada and more broadly the Western European and North America are there to sort of sustain them, as they've been part of this group. They are spending quite a lot of money and resources in order to defend themselves, but they can't do it alone against Russian aggression, potential Russian aggression, I should say. So I think that Canada has the sort of responsibility as part of NATO, and in a broader view as being a good international partner to help to ensure to sustain their security, and sustain the security that more broadly that sort of sustains our own political and economic sort of benefits or prosperity. And I think that's part of, from a very broad level, this is one place where we are clearly able to, if we actually put the resources in, we are clearly able to help these countries and help that broader objective.
Yeah. So actually, defending Canada and Canadian prosperity and security starts with our allies' security over there, as Euro-Atlantic community in that particular relationship is very central. I mean, if you look at it, U.S. relationship with is of course the most important relationship that Canada has, but it has also the Euro-Atlantic component, which heavily also is related with the U.S. and our relationship with the U.S. So being there for our allies is also self-interest for us to defend Canada in the Baltics. That it starts there, so that our prosperity and security is ensured on this side of the pond.
Absolutely, I'll just say allies have been the cornerstone of Canadian defense and security policy since 1940. And even before that, because obviously we were part of the British Empire as part of that, but certainly after 1940, alliances like NATO, our bilateral relationship with the United States is the bedrock. Our forces are not even designed to operate on their own. Yeah. They're actually designed to be what's called a force provider. We're a force provider where we just contribute forces to these multinational structures or bilateral structures, and in sort of a sort of collective view of security, if that makes sense. So this is the core part of it, and there's no place that other than potentially the Eastern Pacific where we see the sort of the need for defense and sort of defense capabilities to be provided than the eastern borders of Europe.
Yeah, and the Latvia mission for Canada has been, as our friend Alexander Lanoshka wrote last year for Inside Policy, an unsung song of success, in the sense that it has been, it's as I pointed out, it's one of the most diverse missions with 11 nations taking part. It has been, more or less no problem mission, no scandals, no nothing. It's one of the largest. It is the largest Canadian mission, be it civilian or military, that right now exists in that sense, being deployed there. So it has been, and it has been very much appreciated by our Latvian hosts, from societal level to the political level. So it has been a great support learning experience, but also leading by example experience for the Canadian Armed Forces as well.
I think there's another way you can look at this, and this is a very sort of brass tacks kind of view, is if you think back to the years where you had the Trump administration sort of levying tariffs and whatnot, one of the consistent arguments that Canadian policymakers made when they talked to America is like, look, we're a good ally. We were there with you in Afghanistan, shoulder to shoulder. Why are you doing it to us? Why are you claiming this is a national security issue to our country? That's the case. Now, I know in the recent years here, we've seen, or the recent months or weeks, I should say, you've seen reports of the United States where the United States don't see that as the case. That Canada, we can talk about the Wall Street Journal article or the Discord leaks that came on the Washington Post about, Canada's comments at various NATO summits. That makes it more difficult to sort of have a sort of transactional relationship with congressional individuals, not just the executive, like not just the administration when we're trying to do economic sort of relationships, but at a sort of even further down at a lower level as the Congress or sort of who are key for these things. We can go and say, look, we are here. We're applying this. And if we're not seeing that, it makes it a little bit harder. It may not be 100%. You may not be able to draw a direct line to it. But certainly if you think about something like softwood lumber or something like that, and you talk to them and say, look, we're here, we're supporting you. We're, our broader aims and we're paying our fair share. It makes it easy. Whereas like if you have a discussion here that talks about, again, like on a negotiating this and Canada's not seen as the case, they're going to bring that up because they say, they may have their own constituents who want to say, well, this area I want to protect, and the fact that they don't see Canada's paying its fair share and not being a good partner, it makes that argument all the more difficult. And I think that transactional view is one that's is lost on, is not seen, because we don't see this stuff put out on the sort of public domain, these sort of discussions. But it's certainly an argument that has been quite frequently used by Canadian negotiators and policymakers when they're talking with their counterparts.
Absolutely. Meeting, in essence, our commitments to our NATO allies is also a way to show to other allies, including the United States, that our interests and our word also needs to be taken seriously, that we are doing our part. It is also defending our interests in that way. And I think fulfilling the mission and the commitments we made to our Latvian friends, I think will going to be an important part of it. Last question, going back to the what is missing from the roadmap. What would you say?
Well, I mean, my focus is always on capabilities, and on sort of how do we acquire them, and certainly, as I said at the very start, some of the core stuff is missing. I think one of the biggest ones is air defense. We've had an air defense program on the books for, I want to say, 4 or 5 years now. It's according to the defense capabilities blueprint, it's probably not going to be around to 2025, 26, and that will just be initial capability. I don't believe they're at the actual phase coming up towards a competition. If I watch video after video come out of Ukraine, and I talk to a lot of sort of people who are there or have sort of observed it, the air threat from UAVs, aircraft, missiles is so acute and pernicious. We're currently watching Ukraine struggle with their offensive because Russian air helicopters or attack helicopters are able to sort of take apart parts of their offensive, and Canada doesn't have a system, right? Canada is not being pushed for a system, and this is, you can't be an effective party without this, and yet we're struggling just to field this. As mentioned before, the urgent operational requests are going to competition. These are not, that doesn't make them urgent. Actually, it slows it up, right? So I mean, it kind of causes so many issues. So for me personally, because again, that is my area, I see this and I find it so problematic given where we are. And if you claim for this to be such a critical mission that we need to do it, why are we not pushing forward a process that allows us to get those critical systems into our Canadian forces? I think there's a political sort of mismatch in this area. It's just that they see it on one side, but they don't understand the other side, and a lack of leadership in order to sort of say, we want to get this done now. This needs to be done now. Any announcement with this roadmap should have had an identification for its capabilities. I think it's, if you are a military individual or somebody who's aware of this stuff, the paucity of sort of looking at what we're actually going to deploy in terms of actual military capabilities in this announcement kind of reflects that in some ways it's a little bit more of a political announcement to show that to our allies, look, we're doing something, right? Whereas we're going to have some pretty, potentially, it's possible they may be able to address them quick enough, but I sort of doubt it given how everything else has gone. We're going to have some pretty significant capability sort of deficits that our allies are going to have to make up for us, or we're just going to have a units that are not going to be up to the task. The Canadian forces will make do, as they always do. The men and women are extremely good at doing that. We've watched them mission after mission after mission go out there with inadequate equipment and do the best way they can. And I think their resourcefulness is a key part of being the Canadian forces. But I think going forward, it really this should have been something that we should have addressed, or should have been addressed in this roadmap, and it just hasn't. It has been, and now they're going to have to scramble to find some way of doing it going forward.
And it's incumbent on the government to be able to provide the necessary capabilities for the men and women in uniform that are putting their lives over there on the line, and they fulfill the commitments, the promises that we made to our allies. And we will continue to highlight this and the need to properly staff and resource those commitments so that we do what we say we will be doing. And my sense is that this roadmap seems to be the absolute minimum that needs to be done, and even that might be a struggle in certain domains. So there's a lot more work to be done. on this issue, and we'll come back to this again and again throughout the year, because this is, as I point out, it's one of the most important deployments that the Canadian Armed Forces do, and it is important for Canadians to understand why it is important and what needs to be done for that mission to succeed in its aims and as laid out. So, Richard, thank you very much for joining me today for Inside Policy Talks, and we'll do this again.
Thanks for having me.